We often quantify growth by our achievements. Did we get that promotion? The grade that we desire? Did we save enough money to buy the newest iPhone? A quote by Nancy Guthrie reads, "Growth comes not as you work harder to get something you don't have, but as you live in the reality of what you have already been given." 15 Lanes by S.J. Laidlaw is a story that doesn't let us forget that. A split narrative fiction following 14-year-old Noor and 15-year-old Grace living in Mumbai, India. Noor is an impoverished sex worker's daughter who's on the brink of being trafficked and pulled away from her family, friends, and the future she desires. Born into this life, she has no choice but to become a sex worker to help her family pay off their debt. Grace is a privileged but socially ostracized teenager who falls victim to an online attack. And although she knows that it's largely due to her own poor decisions, she has nowhere to turn and spirals into a hole of depression. At an NGO, their two lives intertwine, and these young yet resilient girls desperately cling on to hope, even when there seems like there's nothing left to hold on to. By overcoming cultural constraints and the internal battle of hope against self-imposed beliefs, they fight to help Noor escape her fate in the sex trade community. This book is a labor of love that doesn't shy away from important topics we should all be aware of, but embraces the uncomfortable conversation we need to have concerning human rights, gender equality, poverty-wealth disparities, cultural relativism, hope, and fate. The author spent more than 2 years volunteering at a night shelter in Kamithapura, tutored children there, and also provided support. The honest and raw descriptions on human rights issues centered around women, children, and sex trafficking makes it clear that she knows what she's talking about. Most importantly, she brings out the fact that these children, who are 8 to 15 years old, don't see themselves as victims or people without any sense of agency. Instead, she highlights their resilience, grit, drive, and bravery. From Noor's narrative, you're immersed into a world of extreme poverty, and you get a bustling on-the-ground view of Kamithapura. You can almost feel the humidity from the crowded room she lives in with her mother and siblings, the smell of strong liquor, heavy smoke from the brothel, and the stench of urine and filth. As a reader, it's a huge contrast from Grace's narrative, where she has a beautiful home, an abundance of food, and commodities that we often take for granted. It's shocking to see the immense wealth disparity between families that can live just miles away from one another. In the story, we also dive into the idea of cultural relativism, which is the ability to understand a culture on its own terms and not to make self-imposed judgments. It's interesting because Grace is a Canadian girl, so seeing her interactions with Noor's community, we get an insight into the uncomfortable feelings of fear, anxiety, and not knowing how to be understanding of a situation that she has never even come close to being in. We see her stumble, make mistakes, but do her best to be supportive and open-minded. Often, reading stories of protagonists from different countries with a very different life from yours can make it difficult for you to relate or feel connected. However, the author writes the blissful and rare moments of childhood innocence, like laughing at a playground, making a new friend, being excited over the little things, so intricately that it's impossible not to relate. For example, I could definitely relate to Noor when she's playing with her siblings, because it's something that I've done as well. However, the author does a great job at grounding us back to the harsh reality of Noor's life with the main conflict of the story. This is constant external conflict of person versus person, of being sold by the brothel owner she lives in. In one excerpt of a man preying on Noor when she was just 11 years old reveals the environment that she has to grow up in. "How much for the girl?" he demanded. "She's not yet working. I'd pay a lot for a fresh girl." As we are nearing the climax, we see the stakes rise as she slowly runs out of time. Adi, one of the sex worker's son, says, "Your ma earns so little now, you must have seen this coming," about Noor's plans to be sold. This reveals that her mother can only do so much to protect her, and that she has very little time left. Laidlaw also does a great job at creating subplots that thicken the main conflict. For example, there's internal conflict of person versus self throughout the whole story for both Grace and Noor. For Noor, happy or blissful moments at school often felt like a second life. She says, "My two selves, the school-going girl and the daughter of a sex worker, felt like two separate people, awkwardly inhabiting one body." Both girls struggle with a sense of identity, loneliness, and whether or not tomorrow is going to be a better day. There are still many conflicts that are touched on, including person versus nature in relation to the HIV and AIDS issues for many sex workers, person versus society, where there is a broken system of children and women being trafficked, and countless more to unpack. Not only was the main conflict something that is very real and scary for our protagonist, Laidlaw also covers a huge range of important topics within other conflicts that I could go on and on about. If you're somebody that values a down-to-earth perspective of these issues that's nuanced and not oversimplified, but still easy to understand, this is definitely a book that can check off those boxes. So let's go back to the beginning. A refresh of the quote that I previously mentioned. Growth comes not as you work harder to get something you don't have, but as you live in the reality of what you have already been given. Reading 15 Lanes makes it clear as day that the lives that certain children and women have to go through is more than enough to quantify tremendous growth for each and every one of them. As outside viewers, it's easy to attach sex trafficking survivors to their lowest points and forget that they have an iron-strong will and huge amounts of courage to face the type of challenges that they went through. With that said, the theme from this story is, to support survivors of extreme adversity, one should find opportunities to highlight their courage, grit, and resilience instead of their experience as a victim of their circumstances. Our protagonist, Noor, is one amongst many within a community that face extreme adversity. But because we follow her story most clearly, we were able to see how the people in her life were best able to support her. The way to do so is not by isolating moments of vulnerability and weakness, but instead emphasizing her strength and best traits. When Noor's identity as a sex worker's daughter is revealed at school, she faces conflict and belittlement from classmates that could only focus on where she comes from. However, one of her close friends rebuttals, Noor is smarter and works far harder than any of us. But who knows, if we're lucky, maybe some of her perseverance will rub off. This is a great example of our theme and how her friend was able to support Noor by highlighting one of Noor's best qualities, which is her perseverance. She even told other students that they can all learn from her. This theme doesn't apply to just Noor, but on all other characters. While Grace had many caring people in her circle, she didn't feel like their concern was supportive, but instead suffocating. Why? Because as she tried to separate herself from the online attacks on her, her parents persistently brought it up. On page 217, she says, whether other kids were still being mean or were really moving on, the one person who could never forget was my mom. This prevented Grace from feeling like she could move on because all the talk surrounding her pinpointed who she was at her weakest moment, rather than reminding her that she is strong and she can move past these challenges. In the climax of the story, Nora is just on the brink of escaping, but has doubts because of the people she'll leave behind and the fear of the brothel owner tracking her down. However, her sisters and aunties in her brothel tell her, you give us all something to hope for, and that if you can escape, maybe someday we all can. These words are ones that tell Nora that she can make it through this, that she inspires the other women in her brothel, and that they all believe in her. Nora reveals, the weight of their expectations could have felt like a burden, but it had the opposite effect. Their belief in me only strengthened my own. Time and time again, the story shows us raw and vulnerable characters, but Laidlaw reminds us not to look down upon them, not to attach their identity to the lowest points, and emphasize their strongest traits. So let's talk about these traits. The two main ones we've brought up on and on again are resilience and grit. Resilience is our ability to bounce back after we've struggled, and grit is sustained, constant effort towards a certain goal, even when there are challenges. To have grit and resilience, we require other traits such as courage, perseverance, hope, patience, and a strong will. This is reflected in all of the main characters we see in this story. 15 Lanes also shows that each person can have varying amounts of grit and resilience. In particular, you'll see that Grace can crumble under bullying at school, while Nora pushes forward even as she's exposed to horrifying circumstances. To compare struggle can definitely be a gray area, but studies have actually shown that low-income families were more likely to be more resilient than higher-income families in certain situations. One text that comes to mind whenever we do discuss resilience and grit is the famous Romeo and Juliet. This play by Shakespeare also emulates the theme of how we can support others by highlighting their strongest traits, rather than them being a victim of their situation. In both stories, we have protagonists that have an intended destiny and cannot be changed. For Noor, we know that it's her fate to be sex trafficked because she was born into a brothel. And in Romeo and Juliet, their fate was also decided by which family they were born into. This created problems. It prevented Noor from having the future she wanted, and similarly, it created problems for Romeo and Juliet's relationship as well. So how do we see this theme play out? In Act 4, Scene 1, Juliet runs to Lawrence Fryer, pleading for help to escape her sudden enforced marriage with Count Paris. Lawrence Fryer says, "Thou hast the strength of will to slay thyself, then it is likely thou wilt undertake a thing like death to chide away this shame." While the circumstances are definitely different, Lawrence Fryer supported Juliet, not by focusing on the dreadfulness of her situation with Romeo, but realized that Juliet had immense bravery and will in the name of love. This way, he was able to propose a solution for her by focusing on these traits rather than Juliet's vulnerable and weak moments. Human and sex trafficking is a current and existing issue for many women and children, especially in India. In a TED Talk by Sunitha Krishnan called "The Fight Against Sex Slavery," she speaks of how her organization changes these girls' life by providing them jobs.
We felt one of the things that these girls had is immense amount of courage. They did not have any pardas inside their body, hijabs inside themselves. They've crossed the barrier of it. And therefore, they could fight in a male-dominated world very easily and not feel very shy about it.
Her organization was able to support these young women by recognizing the courage within them and giving them jobs such as welders, masons, carpenters that highlighted these qualities and helped them to understand their potential. So how does this theme that I've constantly brought up throughout this video connect to you and me? Most importantly, how does it help us better understand the world? Firstly, we need to recognize that human and sex trafficking is not an isolated issue within developing countries. Cases of sex trafficking can be found in every province of Canada and can happen right in our city. According to UNICEF, mass displacement, extreme poverty, lack of access to education and job opportunities, violence, and harmful social norms like child marriage are all factors that push individuals into situations of trafficking. These systematic inequalities make groups such as women and children a lot more vulnerable to exploitation. If we want to decrease the number of human trafficking cases, we can look into charities and donations that can help to give lower income families a better life. Secondly, as Krishnan once said, we as a society, we have PhDs in victimizing the victim. When we only isolate these victims because we believe they're weak or they're different from us, we reduce them to one aspect of their life when there's thousands more that we can look at. We need to see the survivor aspect of their journey, the courage it took to get to where they were, and open up our limited world and perspective. This helps us understand where we come from, but it can also help us understand where these survivors come from. They come from a place of resilience and strength, more so than the opposite. What I remember is how our protagonist Noor starts the story, and what I will remember is how she ends it. Written from an educated, down-to-earth author, 15 Lanes covers a multitude of heavy, important topics in a raw, enticing manner that comes from an authentic perspective. Pick up this book, but know that your heart won't put it down, even after you're long done with it. If you'd like to borrow this book, check out your local library for 15 Lanes by S.J. Laidlaw.